Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mark Adamski. You've probably seen me on these before. I'm our Director of Marketing at WellRate. And today we've got with us Nick Carls from Hayes Companies. He's an attorney who has been working really hard on understanding wellness program compliance. So he's going to share a lot of great information with us today. And we hope you find it really helpful. Just a few things before we get going. I'm going to be recording this webinar, so we'll make it available to you as soon as well, maybe like 24 hours after it's done. And if you have any questions, feel free to type them over in the question box. It should be at the right of your screen. And then we will field those at the end of the presentation. And Nick can answer some more specific items that you might have after listening to him today. So without any more to say about that, I'd like to welcome Nick. Nick, take it away.
Thank you very much, Mark. As Mark said, my name is Nick Carls. I'm the Associate Director of Research and Compliance here at Hayes Companies. And today, we're going to be talking about wellness plans and the different compliance requirements that go along with them. I put a lot of information into the slides, and so as I'm going through this, I'll kind of be flying along, and we will be providing the slides as well. So if you need to take a look at it later, that's kind of the idea, is to make sure you have the information. And also at the end, I'll address any questions that you guys have. We always have to throw our disclaimer in there, and basically the gist is this isn't meant to be taken as legal or tax advice, and if you need legal or tax advice, please contact your legal counsel or your tax advisor. So we're going to be talking about three different regulations. We're going to be talking about HIPAA, the ADA, and GINA. And first, we're going to talk about what triggers each regulation. As I said, there are the three main regulations, HIPAA, the ADA, and GINA. For HIPAA, basically, if you have a health plan and you want to implement a wellness plan, you can't discriminate among similarly situated individuals based on the presence or absence of a health factor in regards to eligibility, premiums, or contribution. So later on, when we're talking about some of the triggers and giving some examples, really what we're looking for is, does your wellness impact your health plan's eligibility, premiums for that health plan, or the contributions that they're required to make for out-of-pocket expenses? Then you have the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that prohibits employers from making disability-related inquiries or requiring medical examination. You can do this if it's in the context of a wellness plan, so it's kind of like a safe harbor, and we'll talk about some of the design limits that you'll have to go through to make sure that you comply with the ADA. And then there's GINA, which is the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which prohibits employers from using or requesting genetic information of an employee or an employee's families for underwriting purposes. GINA and the ADA both are under the purview of the EEOC, whereas HIPAA is mostly under the Department of Labor. And we'll talk about some enforcement action, or an enforcement action by the Department of Labor when it comes to HIPAA. And then we'll talk about some current litigation with the ADA and GINA as far as the EEOC is concerned. So what triggers HIPAA? The question is the program related to a group health plan? It will be related to a group health plan if the program impacts premiums. A lot of the wellness plans that we see these days involves some sort of incentive, in order to do a biometric screening, or if you have to state that you don't use tobacco, and if someone uses tobacco, you have a tobacco surcharge. That's going to impact premiums. That's going to trigger HIPAA. If the program is part of a group health plan, it's going to trigger the HIPAA non-discrimination requirements. And then also, if the program itself could be considered a group health plan, it will trigger the HIPAA non-discrimination requirements. One of the interesting things that we run across fairly often is employers will have a wellness plan, and they won't think of the wellness plan in and of itself as a group health plan. But if that wellness plan provides medical benefits, which a lot of them do, if you're providing biometric screening or something like that, it's actually going to qualify as a group health plan itself. So that'll trigger some other requirements that we'll talk about later. We have two different types of wellness plans under the HIPAA rules. We have participatory programs, and then we have health contingent programs. Before we got the final rules for the ADA, this was kind of the main distinction that we had when we were figuring out what kind of incentive limits you had to comply with. But now, because of the ADA, participatory programs could also have some incentive limits. When we're talking about the ADA, really what we're asking is, does the program include disability-related inquiries or medical examinations? A disability-related inquiry is a question or series of questions that is likely to elicit information about a disability. And a disability is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. We often don't think of different wellness plans triggering the ADA, especially when they're just participatory and you're asking some questions. However, a lot of wellness plans will have health risk assessments, and part of those health risk assessment questionnaires really could elicit some information that's likely to elicit information about a disability. If that happens, then you're triggering the ADA. Also, a medical examination can trigger the ADA, and that's a procedure or test that seeks information about an individual's physical or mental impairments or health. That one's a little more self-explanatory. You would imagine that if you're going to require someone to do a medical examination that will perhaps reveal some sort of medical issue, that would trigger the ADA. So some examples of what would trigger the ADA: requesting confirmation of the attainment of a specific health goal or diet program. Also testing for tobacco cessation purposes. That one was a big one that kind of was a wrench in the works for a lot of employers, because they were doing tobacco cessation programs, and under the old HIPAA rules, they could do up to 50% of the premium. But then once the EEOC came forward and said that testing for tobacco cessation triggers the ADA, that triggered the lower reward limits. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more later. And then diagnostic testing, whether or not it's tied to a specific outcome, will also trigger the ADA. And then what triggers the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act? Well, basically, does the program request genetic information? What is genetic information? Well, it's information about the individual's genetic tests, the genetic tests of the individual's family members, the manifestation of disease or disorder in the individual's family member, and the individual's request for genetic research, counseling, and education. Genetic test is a test involving analysis of human DNA, RNA, chromosomes, metabolites, which detect genotypes, mutations, and chromosomal changes. And I think I have it on this next one here. Yeah, I do. Really, the thing that we're looking for with GINA these days is whether or not you have something that asks about their family medical history. The diagnostic testing, the tests, things like that, employers really aren't doing that anymore, just because the, first off, the cost, and also just some of the compliance issues with it. They were there, and people were pretty wary of providing the genetic information to their employer. However, if you are doing one of those health risk assessments or something like that, and you ask questions that involve family medical history, that's going to trigger the different requirements under GINA. And that's one that you wouldn't always see coming, excuse me, but you have to be aware of, is if you're asking anything, you know, did your parents have a history of heart issues or something like that, you're going to trigger GINA. GINA applies to employees and spouses. And an employer cannot offer an inducement for the genetic information of an employee's child. So you can only kind of use the genetic information as part of a wellness plan if you fall within the rules that we're going to talk about in a second here. If you're doing it for the employer or for the employee and the spouse. That's similar to the ADA, only the ADA only applies to the employee. It does not apply to spouses and dependents, whereas HIPAA applies to all participants of the plan, so the employee, spouse, and the dependent. So what are the specific requirements? You know, once we know that what's going to trigger HIPAA, the ADA, or GINA, what are some of the specific requirements that go along with those rules? For HIPAA, you have incentive limits. Now, before I said there is no limit for participatory wellness programs under HIPAA. However, for health contingent programs, there's a 30% limit, and it goes up to 50% if the wellness plan is related to tobacco cessation. Now, one of the things we're going to talk about in a second here is we have to then layer on the ADA and GINA with these incentive limits. But if we're just speaking strictly under the HIPAA requirements, there is no limit for participatory wellness plans. You have to offer a reasonable alternative standard for health contingent wellness plans under HIPAA. This one was really hammered home recently. The Department of Labor just brought an action against Macy's because they had a tobacco cessation program. And the Department of Labor is alleging that Macy's failed to provide a reasonable alternative standard and then when they had one, they failed to notify participants of that reasonable alternative standard. And now the DOL wants Macy's to pay back the tobacco surcharges back to 2011. Now you can imagine with the size of a group like Macy's that would be a rather substantial amount of money. It's also interesting because it kind of gives us an idea of what kind of enforcement action we can expect to see under the Trump administration, and that is that they are going to continue to move forward with enforcing these standards stringently. And so we're going to keep a close eye on what happens with the DOL's action against Macy's. Also, under HIPAA, there has to be uniform availability, meaning that the full award must be available to all similarly situated individuals. And that's applicable to both participatory and health contingent wellness plans. It has to be a reasonable design, which means that basically you're not using it as a way to discriminate against participants. Sometimes when we'll go through these different rules, a wellness plan or a certain function under the wellness plan will comply with all these other requirements, but then we get to the part about reasonable design. Why are you doing what you're doing? And there have been a couple of times where we said, you know what, while you're kind of within the rules, is this really being done to improve someone's health, or are you doing this as a subterfuge to charge participants more for the plan? It's a question that has to be asked, but usually, if you're working with your attorney, we're going to find a way to be able to say that it's a reasonable design, but it's something you have to look at. And then there's the frequency of the reward. It has to be offered at least once a year, and that's applicable to health contingent wellness plans. Under the ADA, again, we have incentive limits. It's 30% of single-only plan that the employee is required to be enrolled in, or the lowest cost option if no requirement. So before we were talking about those participatory wellness plans where under HIPAA there was no limit. Well, under the ADA, they don't care whether it's a participatory program under HIPAA. They're saying it's a 30% limit if the ADA is triggered, which very well could happen if you have a health risk assessment or something like that. Also, there was just a decision in a case in the AARP versus the EEOC, in which the AARP basically got the court to agree that the EEOC's rules may not make participation in the wellness program voluntary. And so the court ordered the EEOC to go back and rewrite the rules. Now, the court didn't vacate the rules. They're still in place, which creates kind of a weird gray area. So you're going to want to continue to comply with the ADA requirements. However, we ostensibly should see some new rules based on this AARP decision. Another ADA requirement is that there has to be reasonable accommodations. This is required whether or not there's a disability-related inquiry or medical examination. Basically, if someone states that they can't do something because of a disability, you have to make a reasonable accommodation. Usually this one's pretty easy to deal with. We see it a lot with activity-only wellness plans where someone's unable to run or they're unable to do the exercises that are required. Okay, we're going to make a reasonable accommodation. There's also a new notice requirement that the EEOC came out with. We have a sample notice from the EEOC, basically talking about what is the plan, what are the people required to do, and what the plan sponsor is going to do or the employer is going to do to make sure that information about the individual's disability is not disclosed. Again, we have a reasonable design requirement that it's meant to, the plan is meant to improve someone's health, and it's not being used as a subterfuge for discrimination. And then a big one is it can't be a gatekeeper. In order for it to be voluntary, it cannot require participation as a condition for eligibility under the group health plan or any benefit offered under the group health plan. We used to see that fairly often where a plan would be set up so that an individual could enroll in the high deductible health plan, but if they wanted to enroll in the PPO, they had to go through the wellness program in order to qualify for it. And the EEOC said that you can't do that anymore. You can't use it as a gatekeeper. And they were very clear that you can no longer state or require someone to complete a wellness program in order to participate in your group health plan. They said that's a gatekeeper and that is no longer allowed because that makes the plan, the wellness plan, no longer voluntary, or participation in it no longer voluntary. And then we have the GINA requirements. Again, we have inducement limits. they're very similar to the ADA limits, with 30% of single-only plan that the employee is required to enroll in, which you generally don't see. Usually we don't have requirements that employees enroll in certain plans. So we're really looking at, or the lowest cost option if there is no requirement. So 30% of the lowest cost option offered to employees, and that's 2 times the 30% of the single-only plan if the spouse is able to participate. So you're able to go up to actually 60% of, well, 60% if your rates were only 2 times the single-only premium for employee plus spouse. But you can do a pretty substantial inducement for employee plus spouse coverage. However, again, you cannot do any inducement for genetic information for children. There has to be authorization by the employer or the spouse. If you want to use genetic information, it has to be prior, knowing, voluntary, and written. And basically, you have to say, who will receive it and what it'll be used for. The individual cannot be required to waive their confidentiality in order to receive an inducement. And we have 2 more requirements here that are very similar to what we've seen with the ADA and also with HIPAA. It has to be reasonably designed to improve someone's health. It can't be used as a subterfuge for discrimination. And again, it can't be a gatekeeper. When we go through a lot of these rules, people ask, why do we have these? This seems silly. Like, who's going to request someone to do a DNA test as part of a wellness plan and then use that against an employee? And usually the thing is, someone did that at some time. That's why we have these rules. Now, whether or not it's reasonable to apply these rules to everyone because of a couple of employers that it did something like that, that's another question. But believe it or not, this has happened, and that's why we have some of these rules. And now we're going to go through some common mistakes real quick and kind of just talk about some examples of common wellness program designs. So one of them is a wellness plan should avoid conditioning the employee's award on the participation of the spouse. Now, this one is debated hotly amongst some attorneys on whether or not an employer can do that. There are a number of attorneys out there that will argue that if you do so, you're going to violate HIPAA as far as treating all similarly situated employees the same, because an employee not getting the award because their spouse didn't participate is going to be treated differently than an employee who didn't have a spouse that had to participate. But then also there's a question of whether or not it's going to comply with both HIPAA and the ADA, possibly even GINA's requirement that it be reasonably designed to improve the health of the participants. The question there being, how is it that having the spouse participate is going to improve the health of the employee? Well, I'm sure there are arguments that can be made, and they are being made, and some employers have continued to do it. But it is something that you want to avoid if you can. The next one is a wellness plan should avoid calculating the 30% maximum based on the wrong coverage tier. So they're, calculating the 30% maximum based on family coverage when only the employees participating in it, things like that. We actually, believe it or not, run into that one fairly often. The next one is just having a gatekeeper. There are a number of older wellness plans out there that have been in place for a long time. They've worked pretty well, but they have a gatekeeper provision in them. And so you want to go back and look at your wellness plan and make sure that you're not limiting access to any of the benefits based on whether or not someone completes your wellness plan. If someone can kind of buy up more or less by completing the wellness program, we're going to have an issue there. The next one is assuming a participatory program under HIPAA does not have an incentive limit. Well, again, I've kind of hammered home on this one, but it's because once the EEOC's final rules under the ADA came out, there are a number of participatory programs out there where it's, hey, just go do this health risk assessment. You don't have to do anything else with it. Just go do the health risk assessment and we'll knock something off of your premium. Before that was pretty simple, and that was okay, and you could do it as much as of an incentive as you wanted, really under HIPAA. But however, under the ADA, you really have to be careful with that, and you have to make sure you're not exceeding that 30% limit. The next one has really been highlighted by the Macy's case, and that's failing to mention the reasonable alternative standard in all plan materials that describe the wellness program. I would take the shotgun approach on this one. I would put it into my benefit book if it talks about the wellness plan. I would put it in the SPD for the major medical if I was kind of combining it with it, or I put it into the wellness plans SPD. I'd put it everywhere that I could, basically, in emails, what have you, especially with this current DOL action against Macy's. And then the final one is offering an incentive of up to 50% for tobacco cessation, but then you have other requirements within there that also have a percentage attached to them. So what I'm saying there is saying, okay, we're going to do health risk assessment and tobacco cessation. You're just doing an affidavit for tobacco cessation, so we know we can go up to 50%. However, in order to get that full reward, you have to complete both the health risk assessment and the tobacco cessation. The issue that we run into there is then actually that 50% is also applying to the health risk assessment. You haven't kind of broken out each portion of it. The better way to probably go about that would be to say 20% if you go do the health risk assessment, and we'll do an additional 30% if you do this affidavit that you're not using tobacco, or if you complete your reasonable alternative, your classes for quitting tobacco or something like that. So those are some of the common mistakes that we see. And now we're going to talk about some another regulatory consideration, and that's ERISA. This is another gap that we see fairly frequently, and that's plan documents. Because you're impacting the group health plan one way or another, you have to document this stuff. It's kind of amazing how often we'll look at a wellness plan and it's just described in a benefit book and it's not put into the plan documents. And that's going to be an issue because either it's going to be part of the group health plan, which means you'd either want to have it wrapped in with major medical SPD or just in there to start with, or it's going to be its own group health plan in and of itself. If you have a wellness plan where you're offering different services where people can get coaching on their health and they can do these different medical tests. I mean, that's the big thing there, medical tests. You have a group health plan right there, and so that's going to come with all of the plan document requirements, the formal plan document, the summary plan description, things like that. And so from an ERISA perspective, especially with the amount of ERISA litigation that's going on, you really want to make sure that you tie it up nicely by having all of your plan documents in an order with the requisite ERISA language in there as well. All right, so I just covered a ton of information there, really pretty quick. And so Mark, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Nick. One quick thing that I'd like to do, a quick announcement about what we're doing at WellRight. Our upcoming release in October 2017, as many of you know, we've been working over the past several years to make our wellness program more than just tracking steps and such. And so we've actually been integrating different dimensions. And so it includes now emotional, occupational, social, financial, physical, and purpose. And our new HRA in 2017 will have questions that will ask about those dimensions, and it'll be able to give some direction. So if you want to learn some more about that, go ahead and reach out to us. But it's going to be a much more fun HRA, I think, than the typical